All right, we're ready for our 16th installment of the Cutter Simpsons Unhinged. First, we talked about Lisa Goes Gaga from season 23. That was when, everyone says that's a terrible episode that Lady Gaga went Christ like. Then season 19's that 90s show when we see the plot hole fixed about Homer and Marge, having Bart and all that, that they spend some time that Marge is attracted to Professor August and Homer basically is a grunge guy. Homer and Bongo from season 24, when Homer's best friend is Bongo, a dog, in the wake of losing his mother to her underground work. Bongo bites Mr. Burns and Mr. Burns wants revenge and then takes everything out on Abe, and basically Homer doesn't trust Abe or dogs. Season 3's Homer at the Bat. We talked about the episode that broke the mold with lots of sports players and also beating the Cosby Show first run when the Simpsons were on Thursday. Episode season 21, we talked about the Olympics episode in Vancouver and practically how Homer is like a man. Like him and Marge do the mixed curling for the U.S. team and everything goes well. Lisa has a pain addiction. Season 11, we talked about season 11's death when Maud dies because of a contract dispute in real life, but she gets sent over the edge by Homer, who inadvertently causes her death, and maybe it was some kind of thing to hurt Ned, and then Ned goes over the edge himself, in a sense. Then we talked about season 15, tis the 15th season, the Christmas episode in which Homer is left alone after he buys an astrolabe, and then he vows to be the best man in Springfield, but Ned just can't see him to care about that, and he tries to outdo Homer. Season 9's Principal the Pauper. Yes, we talked about that episode that jumped the shark. How, Skinner is like his character just got taken out and all that. And how, everyone just wanted the real one to leave and the phone one to come back. Season 5's Homer and Apu is when Homer, we needed to do an Apu episode, and Apu lives with the Simpsons for a while, losing his Quickie Mart job thanks to Homer's sickness and how people help and how Apu gets treated. Season 7, we talked about Lisa the vegetarian. In the one that Lisa turns into a vegetarian, mostly to please Paul McCartney with his presence on the show, and maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for Paul McCartney to croak so that they can make Lisa a meat eater again. We talked about Love is Many Strangled Thing from season 22, the episode in which Homer gets a taste of his own medicine being strangled by other people, but we learn that Bart becomes kind of a monster and all that, and how the Simpsons basically tell everyone that Bart needs to be strangled because without those reinforcements, bad things happen. And they just basically said that, it's just ugly. Season 31's Todd Wildfell Forsaking Me. That's the episode in which, Todd turns his back on God after he kills Maud and all that. Ned is so upset he decides to force Todd to live with the Simpsons to try to drive the fear of God back into him, but it doesn't work out. Ned and Homer are in a coma, and Todd finally learns he needs to pray for his father's sake. And Lisa becomes a jerk, trying to convert Todd to Buddhism. Season 35's Lisa gets an F1. We talked about how Formula One is in the Simpsons lexicon and how it was decent and all that. And then we talked about the episode, season 16, the gay marriage one that saw Patty come out of the closet. We kind of knew, the Simpsons fans knew that it had to be Patty for some reason. There are a lot of things, and how I was pissed off that the Simpsons were waving the Stanley Cup under my nose. As a Canadian, I can't like that. And last week we talked about Diary Queen, season 32, episode in which Krabappel's diary makes Bart a better person and wants him to try to be better, but Lisa tries to gently let Bart off the hook, but it doesn't work out, and she becomes such a jerk. And Bart is actually getting closure because Edna could have left Springfield at any time, but didn't want to because of Bart. We are not going to do a Simpsons episode this time. Well, season 33 had nothing, and that was the randomization. So now we go. So I'm going to go off the board and go with a Simpsons episode that, well, it plays like a Simpsons episode, but it's a Family Guy episode. That's right. We're going back to 2014, and we're going to be looking at a Family Guy episode to deal with the Simpsons. It is true. It's damn true. Sit back and relax. It's the Simpsons guy. It seems to me that all you see are shows lasting more than 30 years on TV, but where are those good old fashioned values on which we used to rely? The Simpsons, oh, attacked the Family Guy. They made them last longer, even if stronger. Thank you, Family Guy. Laugh and cry. We are indebted to Family Guy. Fuck you. So the supersized Cutter Simpsons Unhinged begins with the episode of the Family Guy called The Simpsons Guy. Season 13 start on September 28th, 2014. Simpsons, an hour previous at 8 Eastern Time, played a episode called Clown in the Dumps. Krusty gets owned on a celebrity roast. He tries to talk to Rabbi Krastovsky, excuse me, about is his comedy good? And he goes, nah. And then he doesn't finish his thought and he dies. And Krusty's left to pick up the pieces of what happened. In the meantime, Krusty's father's death actually has an impact on Lisa. Not in the list Bart. Bart is Krusty's biggest fan and big stalker, maybe. But Lisa, for some strange reason, decides to try to obsess over Homer's health. She knows Homer's health is bad and all that. She even tries to see Homer on a webcam to make sure he's sleeping okay and all that. And Marge tries desperately to try to get Lisa off their backs. Homer then finally tells Lisa, saying that he doesn't live for too much time, like 5 minutes past the day and all that. He doesn't plan much in advance because he's scared too. Well, Lisa wraps him in bubble wrap, and then fortunately for Homer, he's okay. It's auto crashes into him, but it's okay. Lisa then tells Homer that she only wanted a tiny bit of control. This reminds me of the Degrassi episode in season 6 when Emma and Manny hug it out. And Emma probably would say she wanted control of Manny and all that. That's a different story. So then, Family Guy puts up their episode, The Simpsons Guy, an hour later at 9 o'clock. So the season 13 premiere of Family Guy starts with a Modern Family, All in the Family crossover and all that. And Chris says that, oh boy, these crossovers don't reek of desperation and all that. Of course, it kind of does. Stewie points that out. And then Peter comes by and is appalled because the comics show Dennis the Menace being helpful. He's not a menace anymore. But let's not forget that what Dennis the Menace's problems were in the 1950s and 60s on that TV show is very, very freaking tame by 2025 standards. It'd probably be more like a G or PG rating, if you will. But yeah, people thought that Dennis's antics were terrible in the 50s, even though he's trying to be helpful. All that. So Peter decides to write his own comic strip, and it does decently too. But the fact of the matter is that it starts to get misogynistic, and Peter basically says, well, you guys applaud a freaking cake for 15 minutes or something like that. So basically, Peter doesn't help his own cause. There is a brick thrown through the window, but Peter says, there's my brick. And then a second brick comes in. Wait a minute, that's not the brick. So they basically flee. So, anyhow, they run into a thing. Well, they go to a gas station, but their car is stolen. So they have to walk outside Springfield. And Stewie then basically says that, we're not allowed to say which Springfield it is. So they go into the Quickie Mart and for supplies, and Homer introduces himself and all that. They talk to Apu and everything else. So Homer takes Peter to the police station to report the missing vehicle. But all Chief Wiggum wants to know is how much Peter puts into the policeman's ball. Peter's like, none, I'm a tourist. Well, I'll put your file into this circular file that I rarely touch. Basically stating that, if you don't contribute to the policeman's ball, good luck. We ain't going to help you. They're corrupt. Well, doy. So anyway, Homer invites the Griffins to stay with his family and all that. Marge thanks them for not being murder hippies, murderers. And Homer says, "You, that one band of hippie murderers in the house, and you get accused of it." So practically, the Simpsons and Family Guy decide to split up into pairs. Bart and Stewie are a pair. Bart shows Stewie the the greatness of a prank call, but Stewie takes it a little dark and all that. Stewie is, of course, appalled that Bart is being attacked by Nelson so many times, so he's upset. And then, you know, Marge and Lois pair up and all of that. But Lois gets tired of Marge's antics. That Marge actually is happy that they show movies in the afternoon, and that she couldn't stand Surf's Up because she was worried about the penguins surfing and all that. Brian gets put into his place with Santa's little helper, as Marge does not value Brian's opinions and all that. So basically thinking that Brian's just like Santa's little helper, gutter trash. Santa's little helper does flee the house for a little bit. Brian and Chris, who of course gets stuffed into it, well, Chris and Maggie don't really have much in common. You gotta say that, they try to get Santa's little helper back and all that. Lisa and Meg are basically paired up and all that. Meg tells about how she's being tortured by Peter, who gives her a gun for Christmas and all that. You know why. And then basically Lisa says to Meg, say, "I matter." And then Peter says, "Shut up, Meg, you don't matter." So Lisa decides to try to get Meg into something and find Meg's talent. Meg's a natural at the saxophone. Of course, Lisa becomes kind of jealous and all that. So anyway, Peter and Homer decide to find the car. Well, Peter tries to tell Homer the power of um, cutaways and all that, but it doesn't go over so well. So they decide to do a stolen car wash, and strange as it sounds, they were in hot gear and all that, washing people's cars and making people sick and all that. The police board says, "Wait a minute, we can arrest all these stolen car people," but Chief Wiggum is more interested in the song. Corruption? Yes, of course. So anyhow, it is revealed that there was a um, way out. And the fact of the matter is that they got the car back. It was under Hans Moleman's possession because Hans Moleman mistakenly thought it was his car. And Peter basically says, "How many old, confused people do you have?" And Grandpa with a car. And Grandpa bumps into him. "I'm old. I'm the victim." So, anyhow, as you see this Fox thingy about a courtroom, how do we get here? Well, Homer and Peter celebrate getting their getting the car back, and everything works out. So Peter actually tries to tell Homer there's a sweet beer I manufacture called Pawtucket Pat. Homer drinks it and says, "Wait a minute, this is like Duff and all that." Shows him a Duff, and then there's a label. So technically, the Pawtucket Pat beer is a offshoot of Duff, a copyright. So basically, Homer wants to sue Peter in court. Of course, that means that a lot of Quahog people have to come to Springfield and all that. Peter starts to get a little tired because now they have to do a 60-minute episode instead of 30-minute one. Of course, self realizing. So anyway, the judge is none other than Judge Fred Flintstone, kind of making it impartial because obviously you don't want George Schneider from The Simpsons or the judge from Family Guy in there for impartiality. Of course, there are a lot of people from both Quahog and Springfield together. So there are a lot of pairings. Mort Goldman is paired up with Krusty because they're both Jewish and not really so entertaining, but they are Jewish. Stewie gets paired up with Mr. Burns because they're maniacal and they both have teddy bears. Stewie with Rupert and Mr. Burns with Bobo. Um, Bruce and Smithers are together, the gay characters, if you all know that. I'm actually surprised that Mo was not paired up with Jerome, like the bar takers. Mayor Adam West is paired up with Mayor Joe Quimby. You know that James Woods from James Woods High School in Family Guy, and also James Woods, who was in Homer and Apu together. That's kind of meta. There's a lot of other ones if I gotta remember correctly. Oh, Kent Brockman and Tom Tucker because they're both newsmen. Lenny gets paired up with Quagmire, who tells Lenny, "Do you like sex?" Nah. And then Carl and Cleveland are paired up. Of course, we all know they got paired up because they're the black guys who basically don't seem to matter, but they both think they're cool. So Fred Flintstone says that in all truth, that both Duff and Pawtucket Pat are copyrights of his favorite beer, Bud Rock. But of course, because he has to do the now and then and all that, Fred rules in favor of Duff. And basically, Peter and Fable go, "Oh no, oh no, oh no. Ding. Hello? Hey, I'm in the wrong Springfield." So practically, that's what ends up happening and all that. So now that Quahog is now jobless, like they have to shut down the brewery. There are newspapers basically getting under Homer's skin, saying that Homer tried to be a good guy and all that, but he may have been ruining things. However, the families now have to pack up and all that. Marge and Lois, well, Lois basically yells at Marge, cursing at her, saying, "It's your fucking fault we lost the brewery." But Marge basically says, "Nice to meet you, and next time wear a bra." It's kind of obvious that Lois was trying to get Marge to basically lose her shit, but she doesn't. Um, Brian sheepishly tells Marge that he's lost Santa's little helper, but Santa's little helper somehow was there the whole time. So, whew, Brian and Chris are saved and all that. All that. Meg and Lisa split, and Meg tells Lisa about all her faults, how she has the same shoe size as Charles Barkley and all that, and Lisa kind of had a forced "shut up, Meg" and all that. But Lisa gives Meg her saxophone, saying that even though she's jealous, that Meg deserves it. Peter decides to toss it in the trash, saying that, "Oh, we have no room" and all that. Kind of stupid, don't you think? Because you pissed off both Meg and Lisa to effect. However, Stewie tells Bart that he has given Bart a special present. He has plunked some of Bart's enemies: Nelson, Jimbo, Principal Skinner, Sideshow Bob, and for the sake of making a pun, Apu, and all that. Bart is dismayed by all this and basically breaks off from Stewie and all that. Anyway, Homer actually does try to talk to Peter about his actions, but Peter gets angry and they have an intense chicken fight and all that. That they actually fall into acid at the Springfield power plant and were mutants with superpowers and go up to space and all that. So the fight was big and all that. There was a scene in which they were both fighting on a bus. And Homer says, "Hey, there's a kid at the back, and it's Ralph." And the famous line, "I'm in danger." Yes, the whole Ralph meme about him being in danger, that's the episode. It's a Family Guy episode, but whatever. So anyway, yeah. And then Homer starts throwing Emmys at Peter. Says, "No fair, I don't have any." That should have been the fight right there and then. But then the intense fight, it was basically inconclusive. They're both severely harmed, but they both decide to split apart from each other with a half hour in between. Of course, Homer and Peter become self-aware they're part of a TV show and all that. So yeah, Homer will be at 8, Peter at 9, and all that. So anyway, the Griffins come back to Quahog and actually are happy that the heat has died down from Peter's misogynistic comic. However, Peter's like, "I had a comic? Cool." and all that. Of course, they try to talk about things. Lois gives Peter a Pawtucket Pat, but then Peter's like, wait a minute, the brewer shut down. We lost everything. I lost my job. But Lois says, no, Springfield will have to come in to enforce the ruling. And we all know that's not going to happen. And then Stewie is talked to by Brian saying that sorry things didn't work out between you two. And Stewie basically brushes it off. Although he writes on a chalkboard, I will not think about Bart anymore, and starts to cry. So practically, yeah, it was just amazing and all that. So yeah, it was watched by 8.4 million. There were a lot of mixed reviews and all that to do with the Simpsons guy. But the main thing I feel is there's a couple of points before we get to a part of the show I like to call "Who Did It Best." Because I had my train of thought. So anyway, a lot of people were not too pleased with this crossover. But remember, Seth MacFarlane actually guest voiced in the season. What was it? That the season finale beforehand of The Simpsons, as a guy who actually thinks that Marge is trying to hit on him on an Ashley Madison type of website, for to cheat on your spouses and all that. But all Marge wanted was to give Homer some cupcakes for their anniversary. But the fact of the matter is, the second major point is that a couple years later, the Simpson Family Guy references this when they do kind of a meta episode trying to win an Emmy and all that, because they have been shut out every year. Not even one, not even for music, which is the unusual part. But the fact of the matter is that, Peter talks about how Family Guy has been on the air for so long, no Emmys, and then they actually figured they would pair up with The Simpsons. However, Lois says, well, that worked as well as oil on vinegar because it just gave The Simpsons more ink. And basically, Peter spouts off some headlines that say The Simpsons but refuse to say Family Guy. Practically, it's like the old saying that, if you don't want to say a certain name because it brings back bad memories. Understandably. So yeah, Family Guy, of course, was pissed off that this had to be some kind of episode to try to get Emmy consideration, but they failed. They tried an Emmy consideration episode, but that failed miserably. Everyone tells Family Guy to stop. Family Guy will never win an Emmy as long as they go dark and pale, and basically the family's becoming bad. And of course, you can kind of blame this episode for why The Simpsons lasted longer than it did. I would have been happy if they ended with 30 seasons. Like, that would be 2019. Not bad, 30 seasons. That's a lot of Simpsons to unpack. But dude, we almost have 1,000 Simpsons episodes. You can't even watch 2 per day. You would have to watch 3 per day. Well, of course, there's some Simpsons episodes that are bad for you, including the Michael Jackson one, which should not have been blocked, but you know why. But anyway, now let's go to a thing I called Who Did It Best. So I'm going to show you all the pairings of The Simpsons and Family Guy and all that, and who came out on top sympathetically. Let's go. Okay, so this is the rule. I'm going to go with the pairings, like the least likely pairs to the least impactful pairings to the most impactful pairings. So if we go by that standard, then it is going to be a 6-pack of people. First of all, we have Peter and Maggie. Sorry, Chris and Maggie. Chris complains at the dinner table. Maggie gives him a pacifier and all that. So Chris and Maggie are practically the left out type of people and all that. Chris ends up going into Brian's storyline, I guess, because they wanted to give Chris something to do. But poor Maggie got bit and all that. Chris didn't really help matters with the whole Santa's Little Helper timeline. So I'm going to give the point to Maggie. I mean, yeah, Maggie was not really featured as much, but of course, the Simpsons writers forget all about Maggie in many episodes and all that. And Chris didn't have his own cause. I mean, you can say that Chris at least showed up and they screwed Maggie over, which should give the point to Family Guy. So I guess Family Guy, because at least they gave Chris some help, but not Maggie. So next Number 5 is the Brian Cecil Helper stuff. Um, yeah, so Brian gets dragged into Cecil Helper's timeline only because Marge does not value dogs, which is the stupidest thing you can think of. There was a Simpsons episode years later in which a court ruling said that dogs were more important than people and all that, and basically piss off Springfield. But the fact of the matter is, when this was aired in 2014, that Brian was basically put in the line of Sansa Helper, at the level of Sansa Helper. Sansa Helper practically does show that even though he looks dumb and all that, he can pull off a rabbit out of his hat. And Brian just got dragged into it. It's kind of weird how Family Guy dragged Brian into this. But bear in mind that Brian had basically been a decent character for the first like 4 or 5 seasons. But then he started turning preachy and stupid and, whiny and a lot of things. Clyde was right about a lot of things when he mocked Brian for his views and all that. But the fact is that Brian at least was a good character. They did kill Brian off a few years later, or tried to, and then 2 weeks later they brought him back. Probably as a way to tell people to respect the people you love, but it turned out to be corny. Personally, I feel for Family Guy. I mean, Cecil Helper is smart and all that, but you know what? I'm gonna give Brian the point on this. So point Family Guy on this because I think at least he made an effort, even though he was put in a terrible spot. At number 4 for the pairings, it's gonna be Marge and Lois and all that. It's kind of weird. Both of them don't really interact as much, and of course, you know, Lois is upset that Marge is saying wow to a matinee, an afternoon movie, and surfs up and all that. I think she got annoyed that Marge's antics and all that. And then Lois yells at Marge and basically puts a few profanities in, and Marge basically tells her in her own Marge way, nice to meet you, wear a bra next time. I think it is obvious that Lois was trying to get Marge to lose her shit. But Marge, even though that we all know about her psychological problems, which we will get to in a later episode, I promise, doesn't take the bait. She just basically says it in her Marge type of thing. Marge does show anger at times and all that. I know a lot of people say that Marge should have just yelled at Lois back, and all that, put Lois in her place. To be fair, I'm going to give Lois the point because Marge basically showed how shallow she was and how much, Lois is a whole lot different than Marge. She deals with her family on a daily basis, and Marge basically is what they call a space filler at times. So I'm going to give it to Lois on this one. Marge kind of could have put Lois in her place, but she chose to be so naive, stupid. The number 3 most impactful pairing is Lisa and Meg and all that. Lisa, yeah, they're the daughters that basically get neglected by their fathers and all that. Homer does neglect Lisa on many occasions, and Peter neglects Meg. But on the good side for Lisa is that at least she doesn't get physically neglected, unlike Meg. Meg shows her sorrows and all that, and Lisa hears about how bad she's got it and all that, gives her a saxophone. And practically, Meg plays the saxophone to perfection, and Lisa has her jealousy fit and all that. Although Lisa does try to fix the problem by giving Meg the saxophone and giving a very forced shut up Meg. You can tell that Yeardley Smith did not want to say that to Mila Kunis. So, looking at this, you gotta feel bad for Meg and all that. You got to feel bad for Lisa too. I mean, I think Meg should get a break. I mean, yeah, everyone just likes to crap on her, and Meg, see her seashell party. Say that 3 times fast. Basically, it decides to blast her family, basically making her the butt end of the jokes and all that. And basically, they fall apart. And then Brian convinces Meg, or half convinces Meg, to basically be the butt end of the jokes because then the family dynamic would work. And it's actually a sad tale about how people in toxic relationships or toxic families just stay there and they have chances to leave. There's even a Meg episode, I think 3-4 years later, that she actually was inadvertently caused to be dead of a car accident because of her license, but her license was given to the wrong person. Meg then pretends to be dead and moves out, and nobody cares about her at her funeral in a sense, except for the Griffins who had to obligatory thing. Meg then decides to come back to Quahog, which was the stupidest thing possible because, she's now away. She can now thrive. I think Chris kind of did put her, force her back because, Chris misses her and basically, needs to know that Meg's alive and for the attention. But yeah, Lisa does have a streak of jealousy. In the episode Smart and Smarter, Maggie does well on an IQ test at a preschool thing, and she scores higher than Lisa in effect. So basically, Lisa gets jealous. She actually has an identity crisis and pretends to be like a stand-up comedian, a goth girl, and a few other things. She gets badmouthed for trying to ruin Maggie, but it's revealed that Maggie is the mind of a baby, and Lisa was subconsciously trying to help Maggie. So I think, in a sense, Meg should get some recognition. I mean, Lisa's jealousy is bad, but at least Lisa does do what Bart does many times act like a jerk, but then tries to fix the situation. The number two most impactful pairing is, of course, Bart and Stewie. So yeah, they both are troublemakers. They both are mischievous and both pull massive pranks. Bart's phone pranks are decent and all that, kind of cute. But Stewie, when he talks to Mo, says, "I just raped your sister." His words, not mine. So that's kind of gruesome. I mean, Stewie does try to be like Bart, be on a skateboard, wear the same clothes as him, and then is angry that, Bart gets pushed around by Nelson. So he decides to take every one of Bart's enemies and try to ruin them. However, Stewie, of course, would get shocked that Bart actually called him out on it, saying that this is not cool and all that. Now, it does speak to the main thing. Remember when I talked about Dennis the Menace at the start of the video? Well, the start of the episode synopsis? Well, Bart thinks he's Dennis the Menace. He says he's this century's Dennis the Menace, of course, 21st century. Look at this. Dennis the Menace causes a lot of trouble, but the majority of it is when he tries to be helpful and tries to be okay and all that. People in the 1950s, what they call troubled kids, is a lot different than 2025. Let me tell you that. So, or 2026, we live in now. But you get the point. So the fact of the matter is that this Stewie basically makes Bart look good, and I give the point to Bart and all of that. So, because of the simple fact that for everyone saying that Bart is a bad character and a bad influence, and yes, from the early days to at least 2014 when they were in season 25 or something close to that Bart has trouble. Bart does do pranks that basically are more destructive than funny, and basically more trying to get his parents to notice him, and Bart, craving attention and all that bullshit. But for how bad Bart's stuff is, Stewie's is a way worse. Stewie just proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that for people who hate Bart's stuff, Stewie is way, way darker. Bart doesn't even think about torturing his enemies and all that, although he could. He kind of does torture Principal Skinner in a sense. But the fact of the matter is that, Bart does get revenge on Nelson a few times, and Bart and Nelson will have an interaction in the next Simpsons Unhinged, I promise you. But yeah, Stewie just made Bart look pretty good. I know a lot of people hate on that, but hey, for Bart stuff, it could have been worse. All right, and finally, number one pairing is the Peter and Homer pairing. They both have massive similarities. They're both fathers who are pretty much dense at times, who basically cause a lot of trouble. They have their jerk ass moments, and they pretty much are neglectful of their wives and their kids in a sense. Homer doesn't physically attack his kids like Peter does. Well, except for Bart, who he strangles. And Simpsons try to tell us in that Love Is Many Strangled Thing episode in the playlist that I will put in the description that Bart needs to be strangled because without it, Bart becomes a dark person. And, Homer strangles Bart's bad tendencies out. Okay, fine, but strangling kid is not good. You can't do that in real life because the kid will die quickly. And yes, Bart does simulate the strangulation sometimes too, because in the Simpsons movie, as I said, that he does pretend, he does kind of go through the motions when Ned, he thinks Ned's going to strangle him, but Ned doesn't. Ned just pats him on the shoulder and all that. But of course, yeah, Peter just basically beats up on his children. He psychologically abuses them, especially even Chris. Like, you'd be thinking, well, he doesn't do that. Well, I can't remember if it was after this episode or not. I think after this season that Peter does marry Chris because Chris gets all of Carter's money and all that, and Peter's worried if he's not going to get any of it. Of course, the torture with Meg and all that is just horrible and everything. Like, he puts Brian through the ringer and all that, even though that Brian does put Peter through the ringer at times. And, Peter is neglectful towards Stewie. Homer, on the other hand, and Peter basically gets into trouble with Lois. Homer and Marge don't really have a picture perfect marriage themselves, but they stick together. Uh, Homer, kind of strangles Bart, but as I said, Homer neglects Lisa just like Peter neglects Meg, but Lisa at least doesn't get the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of being physically assaulted. And, he doesn't pay attention to the baby. Of course, that'd be Maggie. So the question on Emma's lips is, who did better? Who came out on top? Well, obviously it's Homer. Despite this being a Family Guy episode, I think this was the tipping point. It made Homer look good, and it probably helped The Simpsons to keep going 10 years too long. I mean, we're at season 37. You should have stopped at season 30. Great, end this thing. But no, The Simpsons momentum was actually stalling quite a bit. I think that this episode, Peter and Family Guy made The Simpsons look good, so much so they're still going, and we'll get to season 40 no matter what under the new deal. I think, in all essence, that Peter just made Homer look good and all that. Peter's callousness and all that. It just made Homer and The Simpsons look good. And in essence, Family Guy just made The Simpsons look good. And their plans to be a good show backfired. Backfired. That's all I got to say. Anyway, next week, we do have an episode from season 10. So we're going to go way back in The Simpsons canon. We're going to go to an episode that explores the Bart Marge dynamic and all that, and how Bart does do bad things, but almost always he'll try to fix the problem. Anyway, thanks for watching the supersized episode of Cutter Simpsons Unhinged. I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.